Well, good morning. Um, I'm Michael Fisher, and today we have Melissa Soenke with us, and this is our second talk on FearTalk. It'll be number 17, and we've been talking on the topic of terror, and we also decided we could also call it the topic of fear. And basically, we're looking at what is fear management, what is terror management, and you work in the research area. I think we'll just drop right in, Melissa. And you were saying, I remember in the last talk that being a researcher and studying this phenomenon of how people manage terror, as a social psychologist and researcher, you found it interesting and a different perspective to stand back and watch and observe in a sense. And you also said that terror management theory per se, you didn't feel was necessarily your mode of actually managing your own terror, anxiety, fear. Do you want to make any comments about that?
Yeah, I think that for some it can be, we talk about like cultural worldviews in TMT a lot and kind of how those worldviews help you to get that sense of kind of security, meaning, longevity. And so I think that for some researchers in TMT, perhaps it is a kind of meaning system of its own. I think that it does a lot to explain things that we see out in the world. And I really enjoy that aspect of it. And I enjoy the research. And I definitely recognize that I'm also invested in my own, worldviews that help me to kind of see the meaning and to manage that kind of anxiety that thinking about death can arouse.
What would be some of your approaches to that management, your worldview and or other practices?
Yeah, so I do a lot of work in religion, and I am myself religious. So
Okay.
that is one of the systems that really offers me a lot of comfort. I also am an academic and participate in this kind of system where things that kind of give me meaning might be publishing research, but I think more often the direct impact that I have on students and their goals, kind of moving forward in their academic careers. So I think that those are some ways that definitely I feel that I'm invested in this kind of meaning system and in leaving a legacy, perhaps.
Right. And of course you're nicely rewarded at times too as being a
Yeah.
professional. So it's validating, right? The very fact that you do get paid for what you do is a
Yeah.
type of validation on the cultural, social cultural level. And obviously, that makes it even more meaningful that, oh, you're doing something valuable. Because many of us on the outsides and the margins, who cannot always find those mainstream positions, we are always trying to be invent. Someone like myself as an independent scholar, and you're just trying to grab for attention, and the validity is hard to find. So I go through a lot of my own terror of that kind of isolation and alienation from the mainstream. So part of my talking on these fear talks and creating these dialogues is it probably one of my strategies, to manage my own terror of that social isolation, almost a kind of social death that's easy to experience when you're a really creative person. You're working in edges that people go, "Wow, we don't understand. Have you done research on that? Do you have funding? Who are you belong to? Where do you work?" And I have to deal with all those questions, even if it's at a party, right? Like, where do you work? Oh, well, I work in my basement.
You bring up such an interesting idea because last time I remember, when we were talking about the my work, you mentioned, right? You're still excited about academia. And so I think you do bring up a really important point because we do all, as academics, go through a lot of burnout. And I think that you bring up one of the main sources is that feeling that we don't always get the validation that we need from this field. And the field moves in its own directions of what's interesting, what's sexy, right? Research at the time. And so it can be really difficult. So, like a lot of the burnout research does talk about how important it is to have these different aspects of self. And maybe that can be something we talk about in the context of TMT, that if we're putting all of our immortality project in this kind of capricious academic system, I think that that can be very dangerous for many of us.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, we're talking about whether it's the academic system or any kind of professional role and or just a role that you've taken on. It may not be quote professional, but you've taken on certain identity roles, right?
Yeah.
And so you do and teach courses in motivation and personality, I understand. And um, I wonder if sometimes when you're teaching those courses, do you sort of, let's just take a personality course you're teaching on all the theories of personality and so on. And in the back of your mind, are you not, I mean, I would if I was teaching one of those, not that I ever have. I'd always have in the back of my mind, these theories are all missing a fundamental aspect.
Mhm.
That is the aspect that terror management theory raises, and I raise in my own work,
Yeah.
as in which I'll talk about perhaps later in our talk this morning. Um, do you ever get that feeling that they're missing something so fundamental? I wonder, do you have to feel like you have to sneak in an existential point of view, from terror management?
Yeah, well, naturally I do. I teach TMT in all my classes. My
Oh
students
dear.
do tend to gravitate toward it, and
Uh,
especially recently with COVID, a lot of them really feel like they've experienced the theory firsthand, and so there are a lot of connections that they make. I remember being very drawn to it when I was first introduced to it in undergraduate. Um, and for me, I think it is, like you say, for many of us, we feel like it's the missing piece. It's the thing that makes us go, aha, like so much of what I see in the world now makes sense. And I think it is important to think about with personality development, an existential perspective. I think Freud focuses obviously very, much on kind of the sexual motivations, but he does bring in that kind of more aggressive motives and the darker side of humanity later in his work. And I think that Becker, coming out of Ronk and some of that tradition, really picks up on that there's something very important in how we develop these systems that we've been discussing for managing our existential concerns, and that really is fundamental to who we are as individuals, maybe.
so in really simple terms, again, if I was teaching motivation or personality or, leadership development or anything really human development, I guess one of the things that I perspective I come to, which it overlaps with and crosses with terror management theory, and I came across this in my own experience, my own reading. Um, I had read a little bit of Becker, but hadn't, zoomed in on it yet. That took probably a few decades, and then I really started looking at. But it was just really simply, I think, for viewers, what are we talking about here? How does fear shape everything we do?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just trying to find the simplest language for what we are talking about. And then if you go terror, how does terror shape everything we do? Some people have said, I mean, I remember reading a quote just recently, if we really face the truth, reality, we're all in a state of near panic.
Yeah. But I also alternatively get a lot of, and you may also, the I'm not afraid of death. And so I think that that's also important to acknowledge. The theory talks a lot about that this is a potential for anxiety, not necessarily. We can imagine that if we were all always overwhelmed, that would be paralyzing and it would be difficult for any of us to be functioning. There, I think, some really funny examples, even on popular television shows. Like there's one I always think of and kind of talk to my students about from the Big Bang Theory, where one of the main characters becomes concerned about the fragility of his physical body and begins to only interact with people through a computer. And so I think that, it captures, it's humorous, but captures what can happen if we become paralyzed, right? We lose all of the meaning that our daily lives and the activities that we do might have. Yeah, we might feel, I think COVID's a good example. Many people felt afraid to leave the house. And so those are those very kind of literal examples of the fear. But I think a lot of people, it's more of that potential for anxiety that is understood. And that if we've got these kind of maybe worldviews or this investment in our culture and our sense of ourselves working, from a terror management perspective, working functionally, we're not going to experience that kind of overwhelming panic.
Mhm. Okay, here's a little twist in that
Yeah.
the reliance on our cultural worldview, for example. I am obviously raised in Western North America, et cetera, et cetera. I've adopted lots of cultural capital and processes that guide me along. And then comes along probably in the early 90s in my research of discovering this as I was pursuing the study of fear. Started in 1989 as a formal focus. And all of a sudden, I start finding more and more stuff showing that there's something called a culture of fear.
Mm,
And all of a sudden, you shift very quickly from a psychological or a biological, even a ordinary biological evolutionary perspective. And you also come right now to the idea of cultural evolution.
yeah.
And then you get to the place, and I'm asking myself these questions, you see, philosophically, but also how do I live when I actually live in a culture of fear? Okay, whoa, that's now all of a sudden for me undermining of the confidence in my own cultural worldview.
Yeah. And so, Michael, I have like kind of what comes to mind when I hear culture of fear. Do you mind telling me a little bit about kind of your exact kind of definition or concept so that we're speaking the same language?
Yeah, well, it's one of those ones that's really hard to pin down.
Yeah.
But there are many sociologists, particularly, and they kicked it off, and anthropologists in the 1980s, and they were basically studying totalitarian
Mm,
regimes in Latin America. This is after the dictators left. They brought in teams of researchers, psychologists, artists, cultural theorists, psychologists, all kinds of interdisciplinary teams. And when they studied that, what the dynamic of that culture and interviewed people, what was it like living underneath that dictatorship? And then what was it like when the dictatorship went down? It was replaced by something better. And yet they were still trying to understand why did that phenomenon actually be able to manifest so that for decades they lived under these dictatorships in certain Latin American countries. And they came up with this concept of a culture of fear. It's the earliest research I have found in the mid '80s.
mhm,
And the reason they wanted to note that, I guess, was that there's a dynamic of basically when you've lost trust in all your authoritative reference points
mhm.
within what would be seen as the legitimate points of power and authority coming down through the culture. And yes, then you might have to find your alternative. Where are you going to get a reference point for where you can trust? Because in those cultures, you got to watch what you say.
Yeah.
Now, even in universities today, you and I know you got to watch what you say.
Yeah.
So the culture of fear
Yeah.
is actually still operative. And this is one of the things that
Yeah.
they went from, sure, this is an extreme situation, but
Mhm,
then they started going, well, let's start applying that to other countries and other regimes and organizational cultures,
mhm.
right? So and so again, a lot of sociology involved
Yeah.
in that. So I think as a social psychologist, you must be also somewhat looking at this.
Yeah, the connection that I was making, and as you're talking, I think it is a very valuable one, is in our kind of even our democracies today, just the way that the media uses fear. That I think you're exactly right, and thinking about some of the breakdown of trust of our institutions. And so, yeah, I think that that's really applicable and an interesting thing to think about from that TMT perspective. That we need that source of maybe. Uh, like the authority maybe over our cultural worldview or the validation. And
Yeah,
so, yeah, that there could be definitely a breakdown there when we start to lose trust in our government or in our institutions, politicians. Yeah.
yeah. And then you've got the post-colonial critique.
Mhm.
So I also see that connected to the
Yeah.
challenges of a culture of fear. When the post-colonial critique, so this would be like from an indigenous people's perspective, and not just, but it could be from Black African American perspective, certainly the Africanist, worldview critique that has come through the academy and other places in our culture that it's questioning that, well, they're basically saying everything that you folks believe about your white privileged culture. Well, guess what? It's a pirate culture. It's a dominating grabbing, predatory, capitalism, and all of a sudden you start thinking of, the students are studying this stuff, right? And I had to go through this myself. You have to come to negotiate. Well, wow, like if I even begin to adopt that critical perspective, let's just call it post-colonial or neo-colonial, it's just like you start to go, well, where are you going to get your cultural references? You see, this is the right, really my point of oh, TMT theory, I think, in a sense, really has to ask, are there cultural worldviews after a while that actually are valid, workable, and
Yeah.
again, okay, well, if I'm not going to jump to a religion
Mhm.
as finding that safety, and I'm more in the secular world, where do I start to look for the new cultural paradigm that I can actually trust, that's just, and that is going to provide the truth? It's not, and now we've got a culture of untruth.
Mm.
This
Yeah.
seems to me what I think a lot of young people are going to be having to deal with. So, do you
Mhm.
think there's a connection with all of what I'm talking about, these collapsing, cascading systems of legitimacy, of authorities, of cultural referencing? And then we've got ultimate, max, optimum pluralism spreading out to, yeah, well, that's your perspective, but what about this one? And, so we got culture wars.
Mhm.
We have a culture fear, then we have culture wars, and you can just hear and think about the amount of terror and anxiety
Yeah.
that is going on. Am I surprised, and you surprised at the rates of anxiety in young people and everybody? Um, and then surprised with the violence that goes with that, the desperation.
Yeah.
Um, and then people trying to build a worldview on a particular just my identity,
Mhm.
a political, what we call the politics, of identity, right? Those of a small identity, and it might be, something very small, and I'm trying to build a worldview about that, and I want you to respect my worldview because I'm trans and I'm white or I'm black or or Latino. All these identities, very specific, or
Mhm.
homosexual, etc. And it's like all of a sudden you can see we're really quite desperate to find the reference. So I come along and I say, well, why don't we try a new paradigm called fearlessness?
Mhm.
Because I can see the way we're going, culture of fear, culture wars, the cascading of the post colonial critique. Um, I can see that we are going to end up in a very difficult place if we do not have a way to reference what we can trust, other than in really small little communities. And then you're going to try to, well, then how do you communicate with another small community that they actually see you as the enemy because you're different. You're just other.
Mhm.
So I started thinking about that, and I think that's probably one of the reasons that, because I saw everything was so fear based, fear mongering in the media, right? The spread of that, our education, the popular culture, as well as the education that we get in universities. I mean, I spent 12 years in universities, and I came out of saying these places are like terrorist organizations.
Mhm.
University culture, the way you have to build your creds,
Yeah.
and who you have to align with. So all of a sudden, that was one of the reasons I think I was searching for another referent.
Mhm.
Now, TMT theory and Becker, they say nothing about fearlessness, as far as I can tell. You won't see that
Yeah.
word.
Well, and I think, like, when it's really interesting, I'm enjoying our discussion because it's fun to talk about different perspectives. I spend a lot of time talking to other TMT researchers,
Yeah, but
and
you
I
do.
think we come at it from a worldview perspective. So we would think about, depending on the emphasis in the worldview, we might see, like, if we could cultivate values of tolerance or, egalitarian values in
Right.
our worldviews, that's how we might promote these more positive views. But I like coming at it from a, little bit different perspective, I think, that you have, of that there's something that is maybe unique about this approach that's not necessarily a worldview. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I think it's probably a combination of. So we can play with it, but I do want to point that out that using the term fearlessness as if I'm, let's just say, looking for a new referent for a positive, right, therapeutic, enhancing for the betterment of all beings kind of model, which is what I'm doing. Um, and I'm not the only one doing this, but I do say that when you bring that word up in the Western contemporary modern society, which I've done for over 30 years, I'll give you an example. I was with some PhD students the other day, just going on a little bit of a walk and discussion about their work. And at one point, they asked me, "Oh, you're really into this fear stuff, I see, and I haven't read a lot of your work." And I said, "Yeah." And they says, "Oh, yeah. And when'd you get into it?" "Oh, 1989 or so. I just had this really powerful visionary experience with a woman I was with at the time, and it was a very powerful, and it just transformed my life." And I said, "We need to develop this In Search of Fearlessness project on the earth." And I said, "Well, why is that?" I says, "Because the love I have with this woman." I said, "What gets in the way of that?" And I asked her, and both the time we both answered, "Fear gets in the way of it."
Mm,
And so there we were playing with this very high level of motivational powers, sources, forces, love versus fear. And then when I started researching the literature, you see that in almost every wisdom tradition, religion,
mm,
fundamentally. It repeats itself over and over. And then in the Bhagavad Gita, in the one of the oldest texts we have of any old religion on the planet, um, fearlessness, abhaya, in the Vedic tradition,
mm,
in the Sanskrit source, abhaya means fearlessness, and it's called the virtue of all virtue. And so this is like intuitive. And then I have this reading and research I'm putting, and I'm going, but fundamentally, what do we want to deal with? We're trying to get people to be able to trust love again.
mm,
I think every religion, especially the Abrahamic religions, yeah, uh-huh. How are we gonna get people to trust love again? Well, you can't trust love so much, but can we trust God or Allah or and you see a higher, immortal, eternal, right? Power
mm,
greater than, right? The absolute.
mhm.
So I think that's part of the TNT search, right? If you can't find it in the cultural levels, you can actually transcend cultural levels to I'd call the spiritual um,
And
dimension.
I think that that's definitely true. I'm thinking about, I haven't seen a lot of the COVID literature about movement toward religion, but definitely
Mm,
the post 9/11 literature is there, and that we
okay.
see, yeah, increasing interest in religion. And as we see maybe a breakdown of the those sources of meaning here on this earth. So I think that that's really interesting and important to bring in. I think Becker also definitely talks about that aspect. I mentioned the heroism last time, right? That we're moving maybe from the like individual as the hero, maybe to the higher power and reliance on,
Yeah,
and back and forth, right?
back and
As
forth.
we
I
see
think
a
a
movement away
dialectic.
from religion.
Yeah, it'd be a dialectic for sure. And of course, I think that is the teachings of the wise ones, the great spirit. The great prophets have always said that. You are that spirit. You are that spirit. You just have to find that in you. You have to clear out all the other stuff away, and you'll find that spirit, the true spirit of the absolute love, if you want to call it that. Just an interesting metaphor of how we search for these very visceral terms. So that's what I was doing with searching for fearlessness. I was searching for, again, we could understand defense mechanisms. How can you
Mhm,
reduce those? How can you create more, plurality and embrace and reevaluate, disidentify, all these different kinds of techniques you can use, which I'm fascinated with because I do
mhm,
therapeutic work as well, many clients. And um, but I've also thought this interesting language of using fear and fearlessness and love, that they are affective
mhm,
languages. They're not in that categorical, more intellectual. And more and more people have said we really live in an affective politics. Our world is an affect politics. And the rational trust that Becker really said and TMT says, well, we're not actually all that rational when it comes down to our actually operational, you know, reality.
Yeah.
I think that's the big teaching of terror management. Don't you think? Is
I
basically
agree, definitely, and I think social psychology generally, what
is it?
I enjoy about it is the way that we distort reality in what I think are very ironic and humorous ways, and so I think that it definitely fits with everything that you're speaking about in terms of this, the kind of I think that's the whole point of the defense mechanisms is that we are moving away from reality and creating our own kind of sense of reality,
For
and
sure.
often to protect our sense of self, which I think is very consistent with terror management. It gives kind of the why. Um, yeah, it's very part of what I enjoy about the work.
So, we don't have a lot of time today, but
Yeah,
in the last 5 minutes or so, so one of the things I wanted to say is as I introduced the idea of fearlessness, you can see just the large ways I started with. I didn't say, oh, this means being brave and extra brave.
yeah,
I didn't go there. I didn't want to put it into a behavioral trait.
yeah.
And the reason is I think that would be a real reductionist. That would be like, oh wow, if you can put the concept of fearlessness into a trait and then identify it, then we can do research on it in a scientific way. And I go, yeah, well, I hope somebody does that someday, but that's not where I start. And the reason is I went transdisciplinary as soon as I got into the study of fear.
Mhm.
I figured that, man, you've got to be holistic. You've got to be thinking multiple perspectives on this notion, even of what fear is. Where is fear located is more what I say. Where is fear located? That's a more interesting question than what is fear. And then you start looking for behavioral traits. No, it's like, where's it located? And then all of a sudden you're kind of, oh, and then, well, so what would an ecologist, so that for, you can find a book, for example, or articles, the ecology of fear, the geography of fear, the philosophy of fear. And the psychology of fear is only like one of discipline out of 25. Why should we be relying on that? And that's what our dictionaries rely on. So we're the crux of that story with these two PhD students, which is interesting in terms of what I call a repression barrier. We talked about repression a little bit in our last talk. I will mention this, and I've tested this so many times. It's obviously field observation, but I'll say to people that I started this project called In Search of Fearlessness. 99.9% of the people go, "What'd you say?" They cannot take that in.
Mm.
They cannot, and I've even used the word fearlessness, and they can't take that. They have to hear it twice to 3 to 4 times. And I'm going, there is a repression barrier to actually receiving, and I'm talking about again, culture I live in, the world here. There's a repression barrier, and we cannot take that word in. And I actually believe, so here's where I get a little bit mystical, is that I think we have a built-in system called the fear matrix, playing off the Matrix movie and so on, the trilogy, the Wachowski brothers and so on. We have a matrix that's built in, and I think this is like terror management theory saying the same thing. We have a matrix to avoid death, and reminders of it, please. Thank you very much. And I actually am pretty convinced, and analogously, we have a built-in matrix to not hear the word fearlessness. We're actually that terrified of freedom from fear, from the culture that has said you are a good cultural being when you are afraid. Please stay that way, at least to a point,
Mm.
and then you'll be all part of our norms, and you'll be conformist, and you'll do all the good things because we've got you in the fear matrix. We've got you in a certain set of value systems, assumptions about reality. And people have said that basically it's a death-phobic culture. And so I say it's a fear-phobic culture. I'm just shifting the language. Again, I want to make it a little more affective. And then when I use the word fearlessness, that's like a contradiction to us being so bought into that, well, life is fearful. Life is scary. And, death is scary. Terror management theory can even kind of get caught in that too. Well, we are terrified, you see. But then it's like terror management theory doesn't even have room for the word fearlessness either. So it's a very interesting loop, and I'm not saying that's good or bad, and I'm not saying I'm right. But those are a few thoughts. We've got about 3 minutes just to wrap up. I
Yeah.
give you a little sense of the kind of paradigm I would say that I'm working with, and I often say methodology is everything. If you want to understand fear and fearlessness, methodology is everything. It means everything. That's why I do not define, because I would have to say, well, what methodology are you using?
Mhm.
What perspective?
Yeah, I think that you bring up some really interesting points from our theory's perspective that
Okay.
is that, yeah, if we buy into this culture and it's the thing that is protecting us from the fear, right? That breaking that down has some very important implications and can be very devastating to people. I'm also very struck by your I think this like denial of death or fear, I think is really important. And I think that increasingly we live in a culture, you're talking about the affective aspects. We live in a culture that has very little tolerance for any negative emotion. And so I'm wondering about how that plays in. I think that it's a really critical piece, this kind of, idea that any kind of, like, I don't know, sadness or I don't want to, talk about major depression, but that, we do tend to have a lot of quick kind of fixes for those negative emotions that we might experience. And I think, don't tend to use them for the information that they provide to us. So I would
Yeah,
really wonder about, I think the level of avoidance is extreme. And so I think that, yeah, people's reaction to the fearlessness, and maybe because of their avoidance of the fear that,
I agree, and that's where the fearlessness paradigm, as I've applied it over the 3 decades of, I've basically come to say, fear of death is not our greatest fear. Fear of
yeah.
fear is our greatest fear.
Yeah, and so I think, that would be where, TMT places a lot of focus on death, and I would, wonder about the connections there. I think that, many of just the fear generally does get back to that existential fear. So definitely something to explore, whether
Yeah,
it's important to have a distinction there, or if we're really like I think we've been, kind of talking about that they're, if not the same thing, very similar.
yeah, they have certainly, I think, patterns of very similar repression barriers to them, death and fear, and obviously even fearlessness. And now, of course, there's a great bravado culture in America and other nations that loves fear and fearless and no fear. And I've studied all those discourses very carefully.
Yeah.
And I can really see how they're not connected to very much depth. They're very superficial and they're all behavioral. And so
Mhm.
what I'm talking about is something that's actually paradigmatic. It's actually a philosophy of fearlessness.
Mhm.
That is very different. And it keeps the word fear totally present in the fearlessness. And then someone says, well, why you want to practice fearlessness? I says, well, mainly because I don't want to live in a fear-based way. I want to move constantly toward a love-based way.
Mm.
The path of fearlessness is what joins the fear-based world and gives a path toward toward love, if you want to use an absolute value, an ideal. The worldviews of love that the
Mhm.
religions and the wisdom traditions and many traditions um, teach. And then when it was interesting, when I shared with my indigenous colleague, Four Arrows, a Lakota Sioux scholar as well, and Fielding Graduate University, we've co-written many articles together. And he says, well, the indigenous worldview, when you generalize and look at it, he says it is not based on fear, it is based on fearlessness.
Mhm. Hmm.
And I went, yeah, that's the kind of powerful critique that it potentially can offer. But it also says, but there's always a path. There is a path and there's a tradition that you can move in that direction. And I would argue that path of fearlessness is the path of liberation or enlightenment. If you can use all kinds of languages for that, it's the transformative path to the unity of the one with the Godhead, with the with the great other, the absolute love. But why I didn't wanna do and so I got criticized when I started this project. People said, "Why are you using such a negative term?" Just to your point.
Yeah.
What, fearlessness is negative? Yeah, you got the word fear in it. And then you would say, "Why don't you start a project toward love?" And then you go into education, and I started trying to bring this into education, at the university and would start sharing it. Same thing, people wanna hear about love in education, they don't wanna hear about fear. Fear. And I says, "We live in a culture of fear. How can you do education without being aware of the consequences of a culture, a matrix that is fear-based to the core?" You can call it death-phobic, you can call it fear-phobic, you can call it otherophobic, xenophobic, right? It's the whole culture is matrixized. You cannot do education that would be at all emancipatory, transformative, without being aware of that. So why would you not wanna look at it? Well, there's huge repression barriers to look at it. So that's where I think TMT, terror management theory, my work on fear management theory, have a lot of overlaps.
Mhm.
And I think there's a lot of communication. How do we actually do this education so it's therapeutic, it's transformative, and so on and so on. That's why I want to talk to you people in TMT. You're also great people. So in summary, we got a minute. I know you have to go.
Oh, yeah, but
How was this for you today doing these two talks?
yeah, this is wonderful. It's really, like I said, it's fun to hear different perspectives and ways that we can talk about these things that, again, you're exactly correct in that a lot of people, don't want to talk about the topics of fear, death, or so I do think these are important conversations to have, important to think about how our ideas and kind of approaches might be related. But yeah, I've really enjoyed this little bit different perspective, but lots of overlap.
Thank you very much for your time and have a good rest of your semester. And
Yeah, thank you.
I'm
And you
sure
too.
we'll,
It's been just a pleasure to get to speak with you these couple of talks.
I'm sure we'll connect again. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, definitely.
Bye bye.
Thanks, Mike.